The garden spade slashed toward my throat. A disgruntled ex-employee, my father's old rival, lunged with murder in his eyes. I twisted, barely dodging the blade, my tuxedo jacket tearing as I grappled for control. The burner phone hit the ground, its screen glowing with half-deleted messages. "You're not the only one inside. My wedding was supposed to be perfect. Now it's a trap, and the real threat is already among us." The rain hammered down as I pinned him, my hands shaking. The messages were clear. This wasn't just one man's grudge. Someone else was pulling the strings, and they were already here. The heavy scent of gardenia cologne cloyed in the dressing room's stagnant air. Michael Sterling gripped the edge of the mahogany vanity, his knuckles white against the polished wood. Propped against the mirror, 3 jagged slips of paper trembled in the draft from the overhead vent. Red ink bled into the cream stationery, forming jagged block letters, "Leave or bleed." He reached for a letter, the paper rasping against his calloused thumb. But his smartphone vibrated across the marble countertop. Sarah's face flashed on the screen. He swiped the glass, pressing the device to his ear. "Michael, it's still there," she whispered. Her voice carried the sharp edge of glass. "The black SUV. It's idling right past the stone pillars. It's been 20 minutes. He swallowed a copper tang rising in his throat. "Keep the girls in the playroom. Lock the deadbolts, Sarah." "I already did." "Michael, the engine sounds heavy, like a truck." The air conditioning hummed, a low mechanical drone that suddenly felt like a physical weight on his chest. He stared at his reflection. The stage makeup made his skin appear sallow, almost waxen under the fluorescent lights. A muffled burst of applause filtered through the heavy velvet curtains down the hall, signaling the end of the first act. He crumpled the threats into his palm, the sharp corners digging into his skin. "Call the security detail on the shortwave," he commanded, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "I'm leaving through the stage door. Stay away from the windows." The line clicked dead. Michael shoved the ball of paper into his pocket and grabbed his coat, the silk lining sliding cold against his trembling arms. Outside the heavy oak door, the world continued its polished performance, oblivious to the cracks spidering through the foundation. He stepped out into the hallway, his heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. Every 10 paces, he adjusted his silver cufflinks, ensuring they sat perfectly parallel to the edge of his sleeves. It was a compulsion, a way to anchor himself when the world began to tilt. He needed order. He needed the world to be a series of predictable 90-degree angles. To his left, a frantic florist rushed past, the scent of crushed stems and damp earth momentarily masking the cloying gardenia. The woman nearly collided with him, her arms overflowing with white lilies that looked more like funeral arrangements than wedding decor. "Watch the petals," Michael snapped, his voice a cold, precise instrument. The protocol for the floral transition was set for 1300. It is currently 1314. You are 14 minutes behind schedule. The florist stammered an apology, but Michael was already moving. He could feel the sweat beginning to prickle at his hairline. It wasn't just the heat of the Greenwich summer pressing against the glass of the estate. It was the silence from his security team. He tapped his earpiece, expecting the comforting static of a professional check-in. Nothing. The air felt thin, vacuum-sealed. The thread in his pocket seemed to pulse against his thigh, a rhythmic reminder that someone had breached the inner sanctum of the Sterling estate. He looked toward the grand windows of the gallery, where the sprawling lawns of the estate rolled down toward the wrought iron gates. Sarah was right. The black SUV sat there like a dark bruise on the landscape, its tinted windows reflecting the aggressive glare of the afternoon sun. Michael turned away from the window and headed toward the library, the one room in the house where the walls were thick enough to muffle the encroaching chaos. He found Chloe there. She was a vision of ethereal lace, her white gown cascading over the dark leather of a wingback chair. But as he approached, he saw her eyes, bright, frantic, darting toward the heavy oak door every time the floorboards groaned. "Michael," she whispered, and as she spoke, her lips moved in a tiny, ghost-like echo. "Michael, Michael." He took her hands. They were ice cold, despite the humid air. "The logistics are handled, Chloe. The guest list is finalized. The catering staff has been briefed on the temperature requirements for the sea bass. Everything is under control." "I don't like the silence," she said, her voice trembling. The silence. The silence." She tilted her head at that submissive angle he had grown so used to, the posture of someone waiting for a blow that never came. Michael leaned in to embrace her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled the expensive hairspray and the faint, metallic scent of the heirloom necklace she wore. But even as he held her, his mind was a grid of tactical assessments. Over her shoulder, his gaze drifted to the small surveillance monitor tucked discreetly into a bookshelf. The screen was split into 16 squares, showing different angles of the estate. His heart skipped a beat. A cold, electric jolt shot down his spine. The squares that should have shown the perimeter guards were empty. No one was at the gate. No one was patrolling the rose garden. The stone pillars stood lonely and unguarded. The security detail, men he had paid a premium for, men with military backgrounds and flawless references, had vanished. They hadn't just stepped away. They had abandoned their posts with a synchronicity that suggested coordination. He felt the familiar, frantic urge to check his pocket thermometer, to find some variable he could still control. "Stay here," he told Chloe, his voice tight. "I need to verify the placement of the champagne towers." "Don't be long," she whispered. "Be long. Be long." Michael exited the library and moved toward the formal gardens. He needed to find the head of security. But as he stepped out onto the stone terrace, the smell of the estate changed. The sweet scent of blooming jasmine was cut by something sharp and acidic. He walked toward the fountain, the centerpiece of the garden. It was bone dry, the marble basin parched under the sun. Yet he could hear the frantic, wet rushing of water deep within the pipes beneath the gravel. A shadow detached itself from the manicured hedge. Michael didn't have time to react before a heavy weight slammed into his shoulder. He spun, his boots skidding on the loose stones. Arthur, a man he had fired 6 months ago for a clerical discrepancy that had cost the firm $250,000, stood before him. The man's suit was disheveled, smelling of cheap bourbon and the sour tang of long-term resentment. In his hands, he gripped a heavy garden spade, the metal blade glinting with a dull, dangerous light. "You didn't even look at me," Arthur hissed, his voice a jagged ruin. "When you took my pension, you didn't even look me in the eye." "You were inefficient, Arthur," Michael said, his hands rising instinctively into a defensive posture. "Your error rate was 4.2%. The firm does not tolerate a margin of error above 1%. Arthur lunged. The spade swung in a wide, whistling arc. Michael ducked, the metal blade missing his ear by an inch and thudding into the wooden trellis behind him. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the garden like a gunshot. Michael stepped inside the man's reach, his knuckles connecting with Arthur's ribs. It was a dull, wet sound, the sound of a fist hitting a heavy bag. They went down together, rolling across the sharp gravel. The stones bit into Michael's palms, tearing the skin, but he didn't feel the pain. He felt only the cold, hard necessity of winning. He grabbed Arthur's wrist, twisting the spade away until the man let out a strangled yelp. Michael flipped him, pinning Arthur's chest into the dirt with a knee. "Who let you in?" Michael growled, his face inches from Arthur's. "The gates are locked. The guards are gone. Talk, or I'll ensure your next clerical error involves a police report you won't walk away from." Arthur spat, a glob of bloody saliva landing on Michael's white shirt. "You think you're the one in control? You're just a puppet in a tuxedo, Sterling. The show's already started. I'm just the opening act." Subverted, Michael reached into Arthur's tattered jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against cold plastic. He pulled out a burner phone, a cheap, disposable flip model. This was the break he needed. Michael's mind raced with the cold logic of a master strategist. If he could access this phone, he could trace the calls, find the signal, and identify the mastermind behind the day's collapse. He was a Sterling. He was built for this kind of forensic disassembly. He imagined the relief of seeing a name, a number, a physical location he could hand over to the authorities. He felt a surge of professional confidence. This was a variable he could solve. He flipped the phone open. The screen glowed a sickly green in the shade of the garden. He navigated through the menu with practiced speed, his thumbs moving with the precision of a watchmaker. "I've got you," Michael muttered. He found the message log. The first message seemed to confirm his victory. "Target is isolated. Proceed with stage 2. Michael felt his shoulders drop an inch. The tension that had been coiling in his chest began to unfurl. He had the proof. He had the link. He scrolled down further, expecting to find a foreign area code or a name he didn't recognize. He saw the timestamp of the last incoming text. It was from 3 minutes ago. "Check the guest list again, Arthur. The call is coming from inside the house." Michael's breath hitched. He looked at the sender's number. It wasn't an encrypted string of digits. It was a saved contact. The name on the screen made the world tilt on its axis. S. Sterling. A cold prickle danced across the back of Michael's neck. He looked up toward the house, toward the high balcony where Sarah often stood to survey the property. The phone in his hand felt like it had turned into a piece of white-hot coal. He wasn't just being hunted from the outside. The very person who had warned him about the SUV was the one holding the leash of the man pinned beneath his knee. His victory was a lie. By taking the phone, he hadn't gained an advantage. He had simply been invited into a deeper trap. He realized with a sickening jolt that the security team hadn't just abandoned their posts. They had likely been reassigned by someone with the same last name as his. He was standing in a garden of ghosts, holding a device that proved his own blood was poisoning the well. Arthur began to laugh, a wet, rattling sound that vibrated through the gravel and into Michael's bones. "She told me you'd catch me," Arthur whispered. "She said you couldn't help yourself. You always have to be the smartest man in the room, don't you, Michael?" Michael stood up slowly, the phone still clutched in his bleeding hand. He looked at the house, the massive, stone-faced monument to his father's ego, and realized for the first time that every window was an eye, and every eye was watching him fail. He left Arthur groaning in the dirt and moved back toward the estate, his mind a blur of shattered certainties. He needed an ally. He needed someone outside the family circle. He made his way to a private corner of the library, where Marcus Thorne, the family's longtime lawyer, was waiting. Marcus looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single morning. His tie was crooked, a detail that usually would have made Michael snap. And his skin had the gray, papery look of a man who had seen a ghost. "Michael," Marcus said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "We have a catastrophic liquidity event." "Speak English, Marcus. I don't have time for the jargon." "Someone is gutting us," Marcus said, tapping a tablet screen with a trembling finger. "It's like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once. A coordinated, massive short sell against all sterling real estate holdings. The stock is hemorrhaging. We've lost 300 million in the last 40 minutes. Michael stared at the red lines on the screen. They looked like open veins. "Who has that kind of leverage? You need a mountain of capital to move the needle that fast." "It's coming from internal accounts, Michael. Proxies. Shell companies we set up for the merger. Someone is using our own keys to unlock the vault and toss the gold into the street." The air in the library smelled of old paper and the sharp, ozone scent of the tablet's battery. Michael felt the copper tang of fear in the back of his throat. He turned on his heel and marched toward his father's study. He didn't knock. He slammed the heavy oak door open. Richard Sterling was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, the air thick with the smell of expensive cigar smoke and bourbon. He didn't look up. He was staring at his gold watch, his thumb tracing the bezel in a rhythmic, obsessive circle. "Dad, the firm is being liquidated," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Sarah is involved. The security team is gone. We are under a physical and financial siege." Richard finally looked up. His eyes were cold, distant, like two marbles of blue glass. "You're overreacting, Michael. Business has cycles. The market breathes. You've always been too sensitive to the fluctuations." "This isn't a fluctuation. This is an execution." Michael stepped forward, his hands slamming onto the desk. "I just fought a man in the garden who was hired by your daughter. Marcus is telling me we're losing the empire. Do you even care?" Richard poured a slow, amber stream of bourbon into a crystal glass. The liquid clinked against the ice, a sound that felt obscenely normal in the middle of a disaster. "I built this foundation on stone, Michael. A few cracks in the plaster don't interest me. Go get married. Give the guests a show. That's what you're good for, isn't it? Being the face?" Michael recoiled as if he had been slapped. The dismissive tone, the utter lack of urgency. It was more terrifying than the physical attack in the garden. He realized his father wasn't just ignoring the danger. He was resigned to it. Or perhaps he was the one who had built the pyre in the first place. Michael retreated from the study, the hallway feeling narrower with every step. He returned to his dressing room, needing a moment of silence to recalibrate. He pushed the door open and stopped. The room smelled different now. The gardenia was gone, replaced by a sharp, stinging odor that made his eyes water. The smell of a chemistry lab or a burnt-out battery. He looked at the vanity. The wedding rings, 2 bands of pristine platinum, sat in their velvet box. But they weren't shining. They were coated in a gray, bubbling film. A drop of the substance fell onto the velvet, and the fabric hissed, a tiny plume of acrid smoke rising into the air. He looked down at his feet. Tucked inside his handcrafted Italian leather shoes was the carcass of a small sparrow. Its neck had been snapped with clinical precision, its tiny, sightless eyes staring up at him. The threat was no longer a note or a distant SUV. It was here, in his clothes, in the very symbols of the life he was trying to build. He felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. He backed away from the vanity, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. Suddenly, the lights died. The transition wasn't a flickering fade. It was a violent, total erasure of sight. The hum of the air conditioning cut out, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing into his eardrums. In the distance, A high-pitched electrical whine began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound like a trapped insect screaming. Michael knew the layout of the house by heart. He moved through the darkness, his hands brushing against the velvet-lined walls. He needed to get to the basement. Get to. If the power grid was down, the security cameras were useless, and the electronic locks on the gates would default to open. He was a blind man in a house full of shadows. He descended the stone stairs into the basement, the air growing colder and damper with every step. The smell of scorched dust and wet concrete filled his lungs. He reached the main power hub, a massive wall of metal breakers and thick, braided cables. He reached for the emergency lever, his fingers searching for the cold iron handle. A floorboard creaked behind him. Michael spun, but he was too slow. A heavy, solid weight caught him across the ribs. The air left his lungs in a sharp, wheezing burst. He hit the concrete floor hard, the impact vibrating through his teeth. A figure loomed over him, a silhouette against the faint, gray light filtering through the high basement windows. The person wore a dark hoodie and a plastic mask, a blank white face with hollow eyes. In their hand, they gripped a length of lead pipe. The pipe swung again, a low, murderous whistle in the dark. Michael rolled, the metal striking the concrete inches from his head with a bone-jarring crack. Fragments of stone sprayed his face. He didn't think, he reacted. He lunged for the assailant's legs, his shoulder driving into their midsection. They went down together, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing amidst the industrial wiring. The assailant was strong, their movements jerky and desperate. The lead pipe clattered across the floor, the sound ringing out like a bell in the enclosed space. Michael scrambled toward the sound, his hand closing around the cold, heavy metal of the pipe. He swung blindly, feeling the impact as the pipe connected with something soft, a shoulder, a hip. The assailant groaned, a muffled sound behind the mask. Michael pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. He saw his opening. To his right was the entrance to the wine cellar, a reinforced, steel-lined room with a heavy timber door. He grabbed the assailant by the collar of the hoodie and hauled them toward the opening. It was a clumsy, violent struggle, their boots scraping against the concrete. With a final, desperate heave, Michael shoved the figure into the dark of the cellar. He slammed the heavy doors shut and threw the iron bolt. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the most satisfying thing he had heard all day. A heavy, final thud. From behind the door, the assailant began to pound on the wood, a rhythmic, frantic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. Michael leaned his forehead against the cold steel of the door frame, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt the sweat dripping off his chin, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He looked down at the floor. In the struggle, the assailant had lost their jacket. It lay in a heap near the power grid. Michael picked it up, his fingers searching the pockets. He expected a weapon, a phone, maybe a map of the estate. Instead, his fingers closed around a heavy, ornate piece of brass. He pulled it out. It was a key, high-polished and unique, with a crest engraved on the bow. It was the key to Sarah's private study, a room that was always kept locked, a room where she kept her ledger of debts. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The man in the garden, the financial sabotage, the dead bird, and now the masked attacker. They weren't separate threats. They were all threads leading back to the same loom. Sarah wasn't just trying to disrupt the wedding. She was trying to erase him. He stood in the dark basement, the high-pitched electrical whine still ringing in his ears. And for the first time in his life, Michael Sterling felt the true weight of his name. It wasn't a shield. It was a target. He made his way back upstairs, the emergency lights finally flickering to life, with a sickly, yellow glow. The house felt different now. Hostile, alive with secrets. He moved toward the reception hall, where the first of the guests were beginning to arrive. The sound of a string quartet filtered through the air, the elegant, soaring notes of Vivaldi clashing violently with the chaos in Michael's mind. He saw Sarah near the catering tent. She was wearing a red dress that looked like a splash of blood against the white silk drapes of the reception area. She was talking to a group of men in dark suits. Men Michael didn't recognize, men who didn't look like wedding guests. As he watched, Sarah reached into her clutch and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She dropped it onto the grass, a casual, practiced movement, and then signaled to the men. They moved with military precision, spreading out toward the exits of the tent. Michael didn't hesitate. He moved toward the spot where the envelope lay, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed that paper. He needed the proof that would finally strip the Sterling name from her. He reached the edge of the tent, the smell of roasting lamb and expensive champagne thick in the air. He bent down, his fingers closing around the rough paper of the envelope. Looking for something, Michael? A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a man standing in his path. A mountain of a man in a security polo that was 2 sizes too small. David Wilson. Michael recognized him as one of Sarah's private hires. David's arms were crossed, his feet planted wide. He was picking at his cuticles, the raw skin already beginning to bleed. "Move, David," Michael said, his voice dropping to that gravelly rasp. "Can't do that, sir. Orders are to keep this area clear for the service staff." "I'm the groom. I go where I want." Michael tried to push past, but David didn't budge. It was like hitting a wall of stone. David's hand shot out, his fingers closing around Michael's bicep with a grip that felt like a vice. "I said, keep it clear." The struggle was brief but brutal. Michael knew he couldn't outmuscle the man, so he used the only advantage he had, the terrain. He spun, using David's own momentum to pull him toward a heavy metal prep table. He slammed David's head into the stainless steel surface. The sound was a sickening, hollow clack. David slumped, his eyes rolling back in his head. Michael caught him before he hit the floor, dragging him behind a stack of industrial crates. He was breathing hard again, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder. He retreated to a secluded corner of the garden, hidden behind a thick wall of ivy. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely tear the envelope open. "Give me the fraud, Sarah," he whispered. "Give me the offshore accounts. Give me the motive." He pulled the documents out. They weren't financial statements. They weren't stock reports. They were medical records, DNA profiles, birth certificates from a clinic in upstate New York that had been closed for 20 years. Michael's eyes scanned the data, his mind trying to process the information with its usual clinical precision. But the numbers didn't make sense. The markers didn't align with the history he had been told. He looked at the names. Father, Richard Sterling. Mother, unknown. Child, Chloe Miller. He looked at the second sheet. Father, Richard Sterling. Mother, unknown. Child, Michael Sterling. The world stopped. The sound of the string quartet, the laughter of the guests, the rustle of the wind in the ivy. It all vanished into a white, screaming void. He looked at the dates. They were born 4 months apart. Different mothers, the same father. Chloe wasn't just his bride. She was his sister. The betrayal Sarah had planned wasn't financial. It wasn't about the firm. She had waited until this very moment, the moment he was about to tie his life to Chloe's, to reveal the one truth that would not just ruin the Sterling name, but turn it into a curse. He looked toward the wedding podium. Sarah was already there. She was holding a microphone, a triumphant, predatory smile on her face. The guests were settling into their seats, the cameras of the invited press corps flashing in the afternoon light. She was going to tell them. She was going to stand in front of the world and announce that the Sterling legacy was built on a foundation of incest and lies. Michael felt the ground tilt. He felt the air leave his lungs. He was trapped. If he stopped the wedding, the press would ask why. If he let it proceed, he was a monster. He looked at the documents in his hand, the paper rasping against his calloused thumb. He had spent his whole life trying to be perfect, trying to maintain a 140-degree world in a house of fire. And now, the fire was here, subverted. Michael didn't run. He didn't hide. He did what a Sterling was trained to do. He took control of the narrative. He strode toward the podium, his posture straight, his face a mask of granite. He could see the confusion on Sarah's face as he approached. This wasn't the plan. He was supposed to be the victim, the one standing in the wreckage. He reached the stage and took the microphone from the stand before Sarah could speak. He looked out at the crowd, the sea of expensive silk and judgmental eyes. He saw the press cameras, their red live lights glowing like tiny, demonic eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice amplified, echoing through the tent with a cold, metallic authority. "Before we begin the ceremony, there is a matter of corporate transparency that requires immediate attention." Sarah stepped forward, her hand reaching for the mic. "Michael, what are you doing?" He ignored her. He looked directly into the main camera lens. "For the past 5 years, Sterling Holdings has operated under a series of systemic financial irregularities. We have manipulated stock prices, bypassed federal reporting requirements, and engaged in a coordinated effort to defraud our investors." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The sound was like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. The press corps erupted, the clicking of shutters sounding like a swarm of insects. Michael felt a strange, cold sense of relief. By confessing to the financial crimes, he was creating a scandal so massive, so legally consuming, that it would drown out any personal revelation Sarah tried to make. He was sacrificing the firm to save Chloe. He was burning the empire to create a smokescreen. It was a brilliant, tactical move, a lesser crime to hide a greater shame. He saw the panic in his father's eyes in the front row. He saw Marcus Thorne collapse into a chair, his head in his hands. "I have the documents here," Michael continued, holding up the manila envelope. "I am turning myself in to the authorities immediately following this statement." He felt like a hero. He had outsmarted Sarah at her own game. He had taken the weapon from her hand and used it to protect the one person who was innocent in all of this. Then, Sarah leaned in close to the microphone. Her voice was a low, venomous purr that cut through the chaos. "That's a very brave confession, Michael," she said, her eyes gleaming with a dark, terrible light. "But those aren't the papers you're holding." Michael looked down at the envelope. He pulled out the top sheet. It wasn't a DNA profile. It wasn't a birth certificate. It was a bank statement. A statement showing a series of transfers from Michael's personal account to a known offshore gambling syndicate. "Wait," Michael stammered. This isn't what I read in the garden." "Of course it isn't," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying to the front rows. "I knew you'd find the envelope. I knew you'd read the secret. But I also knew you'd try to be the fixer. You just confessed to federal crimes that don't exist, Michael. You just admitted to fraud on a global stage to hide a secret that I've already leaked to the Associated Press 10 minutes ago. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. A news alert. Breaking. Sterling wedding halted as incest scandal revealed. Sources confirm bride and groom are biological siblings. The world didn't just tilt, it vanished. Michael realized with a sickening, soul-crushing clarity that he hadn't saved anyone. By confessing to the financial crimes, he had given the authorities a reason to freeze all their assets, ensuring that Chloe would be left with nothing. He had destroyed their legal standing while Sarah had already destroyed their social existence. He had played the only card he had, and Sarah had already swapped the deck. He stood at the podium, a self-confessed criminal and a public pariah, holding a pile of papers that proved he was a fool. The cameras were no longer just flashing. They were a wall of blinding white light. The guests were standing, shouting, a cacophony of judgment that felt like a physical weight. Michael looked at Chloe. She was standing at the back of the tent, her white dress a stark, haunting contrast to the red of Sarah's gown. She was whispering, her lips moving in that rhythmic, ghost-like echo. Never let go. Never let go. Never let go. He dropped the microphone. The feedback shrieked through the speakers, a high-pitched wail that sounded like the death of a god. He didn't wait for the police. He didn't wait for the questions. He turned and walked off the stage, pushing through the crowd of shouting strangers. He found his father in the library, the old man sitting in the dark, the smell of bourbon stronger than ever. "Is it true?" Michael asked, his voice a hollow, dead thing. Richard didn't look up. "I liked her mother, Michael. She was quiet. She didn't ask for things. I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think you'd track her down." "You let me propose to her," Michael said, his hands curling into fists. "You sat at the table and toasted our engagement. Legacy requires a certain flexibility," Richard said, finally looking up. His eyes were vacant, the light behind them gone. "I thought if I kept you both under one roof, I could control the narrative. I didn't count on Sarah's memory." Michael looked at the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him that perfection was the only hedge against chaos. He realized that the chaos hadn't come from the outside. It hadn't come from a missing stapler or a lukewarm cup of coffee. It had been the foundation all along. "I'm done," Michael said. "I'm renouncing the name. I'm renouncing the inheritance. You can burn in the house you built." He walked out into the rain-slicked driveway. The sky had finally broken, a cold, gray downpour washing over the estate. He saw the car waiting at the gate, the one he had arranged for Chloe. He helped her into the back seat. She didn't look at him. She was staring at her hands, her fingers picking at the lace of her dress. "Go to the house in Maine," he told her. "The one in my name. I'll handle the lawyers. I'll handle the press." "Michael," she whispered. "Michael. Michael." "Goodbye, Chloe." He watched the car pull away, its taillights two red eyes fading into the mist. He stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through his tuxedo, making the fabric heavy and restrictive. He walked back into the reception hall. It was empty now, the guests gone, the tables overturned. The smell of rotting lilies and stale champagne cloyed in the air. He found Sarah sitting at the head table, alone amidst the wreckage. She was drinking from a bottle of expensive wine, a small, cold smile on her face. "You won," Michael said, standing in the doorway. "I didn't win, Michael," she said, looking at him with a strange, dark pity. "I just balanced the ledger. Entry 3,103. The The apology I'll never have to make. Michael looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a rival. He didn't see a conspirator. He saw a mirror. They were both broken toys, shaped by a man who didn't know how to love anything he couldn't own. He turned and walked out of the estate gates, leaving the lights and the ghosts behind. He didn't check his cufflinks. He didn't check his thermometer. He just walked into the dark, the cold rain a baptism of truth, seeking a life where the temperature didn't matter and the world was allowed to be imperfect.